Okay, welcome everybody. Abe Collins from Landstream, thank you so much for being willing to offer a webinar to us. I just turned on the recording, so some of us are here watching live, and we'll also make this recording available on the AAFM website after the fact. Abe is going to be speaking to us about some monitoring and modeling technologies and talking about some potential applications to the kind of program that we're talking about designing in this working group. For folks who want to ask questions, if you have any sort of burning clarifying questions as Abe goes through, you can enter them in the chat window, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also raise your hand with the little raise hand button, and that'll allow me to allow you to talk. But we will have some dedicated time at the end for discussion to get into the issues and have a little bit of back and forth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Abe. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and I appreciate this opportunity to describe the farmer-led measurement and measurement synthesis platform that we've been building. I will start by saying that I believe deeply that the best way to predict the future is to create it. Some of my starting points are that farmers are the critical people in Vermont to grow natural capital and ecosystem services that we all need for a prosperous and secure future. The three Vermont farmer watershed groups and their extension partners proposed a multi-year, multi-million-dollar ecological economic development pilot project in January and February of this year. Part of their proposal was and is to use advanced environmental measurement and modeling for farm decision support and to quantify production of natural capital and ecosystem services. My question to myself always and all of us is, how can we Vermonters support their work? We definitely support the pilot project that they've been developing. And I wanted to share with you just a snippet that I shot from my phone when they were presenting to Vermont Legislative Committee in January.
Responsible land stewardship provides our communities, our watersheds, not just for the meat, not just for the milk, the crops, the vegetables, the fruit, the honey, the maple, or the fiber we are currently paid to produce. Our three organizations collectively represent 221 farms of all types and sizes, who manage 122,000 acres of farmland in Lake Champlain, Connecticut River watersheds. In addition, we have 98 members that represent agricultural service providers and supportive individuals who are closely tied to the farming industry and often carry a lot of influence with farmers across the state. We have a strong and unified voice of individuals and organizations that are committed to managing our lands sustainably and sharing information with others. We can move a project like this forward, especially with help from our fellow Vermonters, you, the elected representatives, and our UVM extension partners. This is our pilot project concept, hiring Vermont farmers to produce healthy soil, clean water, and sustainable working landscape. The invention in 1833 of the Fairbanks platform scale accelerated the agricultural and industrial revolutions by accurately and quickly weighing the massive commodities. In a similar way, we plan to deploy a new type of scale that tracks the landscape's function and production of ecosystem services and provides feedback to managers for real-time conservation decisions. It is our goal in the next year to deploy monitoring instruments on 6 farms to collect comprehensive energy, water, biomass data, utilize 3D soil mapping and remote sensing technology to measure whole landscape function and farmer production of watershed ecosystem services. We will investigate and create a prototype ecosystem service funding model to pay farmers for the production of a fairly valued ecosystem service. We have member firms who are ready to participate as host sites for this project. In addition, our organization can use the networks to ensure good communication about the project and its results. We want to start the planning phase of this project and are objectively working to secure the required resources to get the project off the ground. Make no mistake about it, we as farmers are excited about the role that we play in solving the many challenges that we face here in Vermont. We look at maintaining a resilient working landscape rooted in a sustainable agricultural agricultural economy. I hope you all will join us to make this vision a reality. Thank you very much for your time.
The concept of the pilot project, as I understand it, is to pilot hiring Vermont farmers and land managers in general. And that goes from everybody with a lawn to foresters to highway departments and on, to grow measured natural capital and ecosystem services. It has the potential to increase farmers' incomes, decrease citizen, government, and company expenses related to natural resource problems that we all face, natural disasters, infrastructure maintenance, insurance, business downtime. We can prevent human tragedy, such as we experienced in recent flooding and storm events, import substitution, ecological economic development, fuel local economic multipliers, and bolster our towns. And one good way to look at this, in my reckoning, is to think in terms of return on investment instead of cost, because we have the possibility to unlock massive value creation and avoided costs. Understood realistically and scientifically, I think that this is potentially the largest and highest return on investment infrastructure undertaking in Vermont history. Starting with context and Aldo Leopold's 1933 essay, Conservation Economics, he stated that the history of conservation in America may be compressed into two sentences. We tried to get conservation by buying land, by subsidizing desirable changes in land use, and by passing restrictive laws. The last method largely failed. The other two have produced some small samples of success. This was written in 1933, the year of the founding of the Soil Erosion Service, which became the NRCS. And we've had 86 years since then to, in a sense, understand how effective have subsidized best management practices, public lands acquisition, and regulations worked. He goes on in that paper to say that this paper forecasts that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. It pleads that our jurists and economists anticipate the need for workable vehicles to carry that reward, and it challenges the efficacy of single-track land laws and the economy of buying wrecks instead of preventing them. I think that this is one of the most prophetic economic essays I've ever read, and this has influenced me for 20 plus years. Aldo Leopold has taught me more about economics and about growing topsoil than almost anybody else. And his wisdom is worth heeding as we look forward because of his basic point that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. The thing is, our jurists and economists have not really developed the means to carry that reward. And in a sense, like so many other things, this is falling to our farmers, and they have stepped up to it, as I think we saw in that last video clip of the Vermont Farmer Watershed groups presenting their initial case for a pilot project. So a question that is on my mind is, could the most direct path to a prosperous, secure future for Vermont be to support and hire our farmers to implement, build, and grow a trustworthy scientific landscape measurement system, farmer-developed and tested land management know-how, and natural capital, infrastructure, and ecosystem services? We think so. One of my heroes in the last century, one of the great men in the history of this country, is Dr. Charles Kellogg, who was head of the U.S. Soil Survey for some 35 years. And he asked, do civilizations fall because the soil fails to produce, or does a soil fail only when the people living on it no longer know how to manage their civilization? This was in 1938 USDA Yearbook of Ag. It's a good question. And it reflects, I think, that we're seeing some of the consequences of only measuring and paying farmers for one ecosystem service. We've been doing this for at least 4,000 years. Banking was preceded by the invention of the balance scale, and modern money as we know it started with the shekel in Mesopotamia, in Babylon. And of course, the shekel was the silver equivalent of a bushel of barley. So in a sense, modern money and banking as we know it today started with accurately measuring an ecosystem service, food. the most limiting one at that time. We've had tremendous success with only measuring and paying farmers for one ecosystem service, but that's in what's called a relatively empty world where we had abundant natural capital. Now it seems we're running up against the consequences of mining our natural capital for thousands of years and only paying farmers for one ecosystem service. We're seeing this in our flooding and our water quality problems and atmospheric gas ratio changes and climate change. And it brings us back to the fact that our primary infrastructure on Earth is the soil, plant, animal, atmosphere continuum. That is natural capital. That is the primary infrastructure. And it's the source of all ecosystem services, from food, atmospheric regulation, water infiltration, and purification. The services are akin to drivers, people, and goods getting across a bridge, and payment for ecosystem services could be thought of as the toll. But we can't forget that the actual capital is that bridge. And if your capital is degraded or doesn't exist in the first place, to expect ecosystem services without investing in that capital is preposterous. And it's usually the case that capital construction is on the order of 10x to 100x times the cost of maintenance and annual revenue that might be expected from that. So we have a parallel here in that we have an opportunity to increase the production of the ecosystem services we need. But to do that, we need to invest in regrowing the integrity of the natural capital, the functionality, the overall stock. One of the most heartening things that I know of is that ranchers and farmers over the last century or last 50 years and very concentrated efforts in the last 25 years have been made. Ranchers and farmers have learned how to grow topsoil and biodiversity and turn deserts back into prairie. We can regrow the natural capital. If we can measure it, we can now hire them to grow this natural capital across watersheds and continents. And that's the single best hope that I see for the continuity and security and prosperity of organized society. The size of the job is big. It's probably bigger than most people realize. Here we're looking at the Laurentian ice sheet, maybe 15,000 years ago. And you can see that Vermont was under perhaps 1.5 miles of ice. Of course, as that ice retreated, we got Lake Vermont, during which time all of our clay soils in the Champlain Basin were deposited. And our soils were formed for thousands of years under grasslands. These are rightly called alpha soils, but in fact, they were grassland soils in the early days of the formation of the current biological capital that we're still living on and benefiting from. We cashed in on 12,000 years worth of natural capital in about 250 years to build Vermont, all of us. And European settlers arriving here came onto a landscape that had been occupied by humans for some 12,000 years, the native people of this land, and they came upon tremendous biological capital. And we started harvesting that. And of course, the sheep craze between 1810 and say 1840 really cleared this land. And we shed, it's pretty easy to estimate, half of the topsoil that was on this landscape into our waterways. Soil coring work done in the Missisquoi Bay underneath the water show that sediment deposition in the bottom of the Missisquoi increased some 35-fold after 1700. We went from like 0.02 centimeters per year to 0.7 centimeters per year. And so if you think about that, every 100 years, in effect, we've shed 3,500 years worth of soil relative to background rates. This created massive wealth, of course, and it's how we built Vermont. It's how we built our infrastructure, our state house. It's the basis of our society, is that we harvested the natural capital. And the land has gone through successive waves of regrowth and reharvest. And here we are today. It's paradise, but it's somewhat a fragile paradise. We live with diminished expectations, if you will, because the diminished natural capital can only provide minimal ecosystem services relative to the actual capacity of this land. We're also looking at a Vermont economy that was close to $34 billion in 2018, and yet our agricultural economy farm gate receipts, dairy 600 million, total in the neighborhood of 700 million. But in a sense, if you were running a $34 billion a year company and you failed to invest on an ongoing basis and understand and measure the the capital that is the basis of your company, your factory, your human capital, everything, that would probably not be a sustainable approach. And I think that's what we're facing. For me, investing in our natural capital for the future generations is really the key, the take home here. This is my daughter picking apples. We're starting to see the economic consequences and the impacts on our security and our way of life. Of course, the flood of 27, 84 dead, some 440 million in damage. Today, $1 or $2 billion expected just to be spent to meet TMDL requirements in the next 20 years. Irene causing almost $750 million in damage. I've seen reports that federal assistance since then for flooding damage have been over 300 million, and that was a couple of years ago. And it's interesting because now there's the rise of this payment for ecosystem service movement and simple modeling to estimate the value created when we measure all of the ecosystem services and sometimes components of the natural capital infrastructure. So a report by Farmland LP with a $250,000 grant from the USDA and work done by the Delta Institute and Earth Economics, looking at a range of ecosystem services, found that while they grew $134,609 worth of food, they produced an estimated almost $13 million worth of ecosystem services. That's 2 orders of magnitude more value than they were being paid for with the food. Now, do we trust the models that they use? The revised universal soil loss equation, the Century carbon and nitrogen model, the ecosystem valuation toolkit? And I would say they point us in a direction, but one wouldn't bank on any one of those tools. So if we're going to grow natural capital and ecosystem services moving forward, what are the necessary means of production? Looking back, I put up this 1876 Grange poster because it was reminding all of society that the farmer feeds everybody. All are dependent on the farmers. Today, we might say that the farmers are really the primary producers of what we need in terms of natural capital, topsoil, biodiversity, flood regulation, clean water, and so forth. If we're going to grow natural capital and ecosystem services and reap the economic and security benefits of that, we're going to need skilled farmers on land they know and care for. We're going to need accurately measured landscape function, natural capital, and ecosystem services, both for daily feedback to land managers as well as to quantify their value creation. And a real-time regional learning system in which everybody is learning, because we need to accelerate, and I've found this as a farmer most of my life, we need to accelerate the rate at which we learn about growing topsoil and natural capital and ecosystem services manifold. We need farmers paid fairly for the critical natural capital and ecosystem services they grow, pilot projects based in reality, in the cauldron of reality, rather than formulated in sort of a policy ivory tower approach. Whoopsie. Sorry about this. And to contribute to that, what we've built at Landstream is a farmer-centered measurement infrastructure to manage our civilization. It starts with remotely sensed energy, water, and plant growth across Vermont, across the United States, and around the world. This is critical. This is the physical framework within which we operate. It uses advanced 3D soil mapping that maps the soils about 4 feet deep, all physical, chemical, biological properties, and it enables us to model water, plant growth, productivity, and everything else that comes from soil. It uses a set of handheld measurement tools to do ground truthing, which is then fed into the remote sensing coupled with the soil mapping. And it does select instrumentation of fields and farms and small catchments using a range of tools that I'll describe later. And one of the critical measurement pieces, it's irreplaceable, are farmers' records of their management actions, their observations, and their judgments. And this is spread across the state. Every farmer who wants to participate has access to this. What we found as we've been building this measurement system, really now over 50 years, I'm not 50 yet, but we have senior partners in the organization, is that no single measurement can landscape function or farmers' production of natural capital and ecosystem services. There are a minimal set of measurements required. So these measurements are as simple as possible, but no simpler. They're select measurements of radiation, weather, vegetation, soil, surface water and groundwater, and those are synthesized and used to quantify landscape function, natural capital, ecosystem services. Measurement synthesis is modeling. We do environmental biophysical modeling, combine all these measurements, and get to the energy budget, the water budget, large portions of the carbon budget, and plant growth and biomass. This is the basis for decision support and quantified natural capital and ecosystem services. So how did I come all to this? I have been a farmer most of my adult life. I herded sheep in the desert for years. I have been a dairy farmer and a beef rancher, and every one of those years I had one question on my mind, and that was, how can I grow food while I grow topsoil and turn deserts back into prairies at the same time? And in this journey, especially as a dairy farmer and a beef rancher in Vermont, one of my closest partners was Eric Noel. We lost Eric last December to colon cancer, but he and I pushed each other through the years, and he and I made some discoveries together, and that I'm eternally grateful for. I think he's one of the great farmers in the history of Vermont. As a dairy farmer on an organic dairy farm, we had a buffer around the farm that we couldn't farm. And I went and dug a hole one day, and this soil was characteristic of the soil all over the farm when I started farming there in 2003, 6-7 inches of soil. And 100 feet away, we'd been doing some very different things. And here was the soil there, 18 inches of topsoil. This was an incredible transformation that was achieved in a couple of years. And it's one of the big opportunities we have in Vermont is we can rapidly transform these clay soils by multiples in depth and water holding capacity, aggregation, structure, and overall function, productivity included. When you figure out that you can transform blue clay subsoil into topsoil thousands of times faster than has been widely thought, it leads you to ask questions. How can we quantify the value we're creating? Because this doesn't show up in any existing modeling, monitoring, and certainly in the price we're receiving for milk and so forth. And so that began a long process for me of working to figure out how to quantify our production of natural capital and ecosystem services. Eric and his wife Hannah and I co-founded Carbon Farmers of America, which was the first farmer-led carbon offset program. And we needed to find a way to measure change soil carbon at the time. This is 2004, 2005. And we did a lot of learning, but we found an advanced technology called the Soil Information System. That led me down a whole bunch of roads that led to eventually everything that we built today. I also co-founded the Soil Carbon Coalition with Peter Donovan, and Peter largely drove establishing soil carbon baselines and follow-up monitoring on well over 400 sites around Canada, the US, Mexico. But Landstream is the eventual outcome of all this, is what we have been building, a startup called Landstream. And Landstream really has synthesized what we've learned in regenerative agriculture, which is a worldwide movement with thousands of farmers getting together and sharing information and working to figure out how to regrow topsoil. This has all been experience-based, and we've had the help of numerous scientists. And it's really an amazing story that's beginning to kind of find its legs and get out into the public, that we can regrow topsoil, biodiversity, and turn deserts back into prairies. So there's a trajectory, but we needed scientific partners, and we found it eventually. It took a lot of digging, but we found it in this field called environmental biophysics, which is the discipline of environmental which is the study of energy and mass exchange between living organisms and their environment. And Colin Campbell and Dr. John Norman are two of the outstanding figures in that field. And that led to Landstream. So here's some of the Landstream co-founders: Dr. John Norman, Gabe Brown, myself, Shannon Gomes, a friend of ours named Tom Chi, mapping the soils of Gabe's ranch in North Dakota. A square mile of land is the home ranch. We've mapped those soils 4 feet deep, and what we found is profound. For one thing, we found that our preliminary estimates, and we have a lot of work left to do on infiltration, is that Gabe has increased his infiltration between 30 and 60 times in the last, say, 10, 11 years. Based on that, that holds high promise for anywhere on Earth. So Landstream equips farmer watershed contractors. That's why we exist. Gabe's transformation of his soils are an example of what a dedicated farmer can do to improve the health of their land. From the insights of regenerative agriculture and environmental biophysics, we've built something we call the new scale, which provides landscape feedback for farmer decision support. It's a measurement basis for farmer-driven learning networks, and it's a tool for ecological economics where we can measure farmers' production of natural capital and ecosystem services. So I'd like to introduce John Norman, because when a dairy farmer from Vermont just goes out in the world and almost cold calls somebody and says, "Hey, I hear you're the best at this measurement stuff. Can you help me out? I need to figure out a few things." And he chooses to help. This was a big gift. John has been my single greatest mentor and one of my best friends in my life. And John retired, but he's very intensely for the last 4 years given me so much of his time and expertise to help build this. So I'll let him introduce kind of the story of how he and I came to build the new scale.
So assisting farmers has been something in my heart for the last 10 or 15 years of my career, and I never could do it. And along comes Abe, and here's a way to do it. But how are you going to make this self-supporting? Well, the farmer's got to get paid for more than just the yield, that biomass that people eat or use or feed to something they're going to eat. Some way, directly or indirectly, it's what people are going to eat. And you need more than that, because the farm operation is a lot more than that, and every single farmer knows it. So the plan he had is, well, we need to quantify ecosystem services. Well, I never thought about it this way before, but that's what we've been doing in environmental biophysics. We've been quantifying ecosystem services for 40 years. And none of this stuff has ever gotten out of the academic sphere. And there is a reason for it. It's all fragmented, right? The pieces are all fragmented, but they're there. And if they get put together, we can quantify ecosystem services. So the ecosystem services, if you can quantify them, I don't think it's going to take very long for the financial people to monetize something that's quantifiable, especially something like this. This is just dying to have money attached to it, and it can't at this point. But we know how to do it. So you want to make a sustaining system, you want to help the farmer manage better, and you want to see him get paid for some ecosystem services. So it's got to be self-sustaining, and the only way it's going to be self-sustaining is if it's affordable. So there has to be a way to pay for the cost of doing what is required to implement the biophysical principles that we understand on the farmer's landscape and quantify the ecosystem services. And so we have to have a way of affording the measurements. I mean, no farmer, no system, no commercial system can afford the cost that was involved in the experiments we've been doing in environmental biophysics for 40 years. The costs are absurd. You would have to spend $150,000, $200,000 a year on one farm. I mean, that's why none of this stuff ever gets out. But there are ways now to do this. But along with being sustaining, affordable, it has to be credible, which means there are certain requirements for data and for credibility that have to be met. And that's a big challenge. That's a huge, huge challenge. So how do we make a system that's sustainable, does both management advice and ecosystem services, is affordable, and also credible? And that's what Abe was trying to do. And in biophysics, we know how to do this. We do know how to do this. So what's technically needed to do this? Well, one of the things that we need to do this is the adhering strictly, uncompromisingly to the basic physical principles of mass and energy conservation, right? Of the principles of not creating or destroying mass or energy in the entire system. What's the entire system? The entire system is from several thousand feet up in the atmosphere, down through the lower atmosphere, through the surface layer, through the vegetation, through the soil surface, down through the root zone, through the vadose zone, to the groundwater, from the groundwater to the stream, and the stream back downhill to the lake, and the lake back to the atmosphere, and that whole system. And we know how to do that.
So there's an enormous scientific body backing the work of environmental biophysics, and it's all been baked into the Landstream New Scale. I do not have time to review a single paper. But this conserving energy and mass and obeying the flux gradient relationships that come along with doing environmental biophysics probably seems onerous to a lot of people, and yet it's the secret weapon. It's how we make this scalable and affordable and are able to truly quantify production of landscape function, natural capital, and ecosystem services, and to quantify landscape function, which precedes all that. So we have the water balance and the energy balance. And to get any aspect of natural capital and ecosystem services correct, we need to work within the water balance and the balance of energy, incoming sunlight radiation and heat and outgoing, and the net. And that's tied, of course, to carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and every other element, all of which ride along on that. If you get water right, you're able to get phosphorus right. You're able to get plant growth right, and so forth. So this is the framework we work within, and it's a real asset. So what are the purposes of our bottom-up, farmer-centered, real-time landscape MRI, if you will? Daily farm management decision support, landscape feedback for learning systems for farmers, accurate energy, water, biomass, and nutrient accounting, quantified production of natural capital and ecosystem services, and shared scientific standards that'll both benefit and leverage research science and agency efforts, coupled with watershed analysis, scenario simulation, and tracking of actual impacts of water soaking in, for example, so that we can develop working markets. I'll go very quickly through the various ecosystem services that we all need and that farmers can produce when they grow natural capital and improve the overall health of their land. Every single gap between current and present in these indices that we've created, which the indices are just indices, they're not measurements of absolute quantities, which are actually the basis of the entire Landstream measurement system. But there are multi-billion-dollar markets located in the gaps between the yellow and the green there. This is a big market with high demand, as is risk reduction with drought and flooding, depending on where you are or where you are in time, wildfire and dust storms, erosion, damage to our infrastructure, sedimentation, atmospheric carbon levels, and of course, nutrient runoff and leaching. We want feedback rather than prediction. In order to understand and manage any complex system, and really complicated systems for that matter, you need feedback on the actual performance rather than the expected or predicted performance. And that's from Norbert Wiener, no small authority, the father of cybernetics. So how this new scale measurement synthesis works. We continuously measure landscape function and record land managers' actions and observations. And we're measuring the fast changing components like photosynthesis and weather, energy, water, management actions and observations, and the slower changing components like plant growth, yield, soil, groundwater level, synthesizing these data with environmental biophysical modeling, and holistically simulating in real time landscape function across Vermont on the farm, way up into the atmosphere, down to the bottom of the root zone, and connecting to groundwater as well. And from that, we get management decision support, current and forecast plant growth, current and forecast soil moisture, and quantified natural capital and ecosystem services. Accurately quantified natural capital and ecosystem services are derived from whole system measurement synthesis rather than measuring any one thing. In terms of landscape feedback, landscape function feedback to the farmers, one of the critical pieces of this is field by field plant available water, daily plant growth and biomass, on quarter-acre grids and smaller, but for each field is one good way to think of it. Energy and water budgets for every field, for the whole farm, for the whole state. Natural capital status and function. There's also a big focus in our work on decision support to help farmers grow crops, grasslands, natural capital, and ecosystem services. And these are software outputs that all come from the synthesis of the lessons learned in regenerative agriculture and environmental biophysics. GrayStream is one of our key tools. As a grazer all my life, this was definitely one of the focuses, and it's the largest use of land on earth, helping people optimize their grazing management. PlantStream is a cropping tool, and Gabe Brown, one of our co-founders, is renowned for his ability to help people make cover crop mixes and sequence grazing, cropping, cover cropping. This is another piece. Of course, one of the biggest pieces for us is a farmer-led regional learning system. The old model of we teach the farmers, they do what we say, we want to improve on that. And this gives us the opportunity that all these environmental and management data become saleable outputs by the farmers, another product. Quantified natural capital, this is way too complex to go into, but this is many, many measurements, although as simple as possible, combined into basically one index, which quantifies the status of the natural capital, the direction of change, and the rate of change, the stock of that capital, and the magnitude and flow of ecosystem services coming from it. There are numerous other softwares related to this that have to do with tracking avoided costs and planning different scenarios in the future. By measuring landscape function, we get to the ecosystem services. So here's an example of a changed water budget, and as that water budget changes, the ecosystem services are in effect derivatives of that. I am at 12:40. I still have quite a few slides that go into the details. Are there any questions from anybody that they'd like to know?
Thanks so much, Abe. And yeah, folks, do we want to take any clarifying, or we can sort of at least log the substantive questions and then see if we want to move into discussion now, or Abe, if you have a little bit more to share. Folks, you can post questions in the chat or the Q&A, or raise your hand and then I'll allow you to talk. And Abe, if we wait for people to sort of gather their thoughts, do you want to just sort of spend a few minutes finishing up and then we will see if there's any other questions?
Sure, and I I thought I could talk so much faster or say so much less. I will say that all of our modeling is based on physical modeling. The term modeling is used very casually these days, I've found, but most of the models that we're dealing with today are empirical models, and Landstream uses entirely physical models, and the physical models are the next step. The empirical models are what we used when we were trying to calculate the probability of outcomes like runoff, erosion, nutrient transport based on policies. But these approaches of using the soil conservation runoff curve number, soil conservation service runoff curve number, variance on the universal soil loss equation, and all the models that have descended from those, they're not up to the task of measuring natural capital and ecosystem services. But fortunately, we do have this opportunity in front of us to use physical modeling and measurement to actually support the farmers and quantify their production of natural capital and ecosystem services. I would very much welcome going into detail with any of you in about all the subcomponents of this. I just released, or I just accidentally turned off the screen sharing. But I think that I kind of, am I sharing again?
No, but you could. The green share button at the bottom of the Zoom screen should allow you to pick the slides that you want to share again. There
Okay.
you go.
So the summary of the new scale, the physical measurement and the measurement synthesis are regional remote sensing, handheld instruments, regional ground truthing procedures, soil information system mapping, farm instrumentation, this whole measurement synthesis process, and all this landscape intelligence software. And we have built this in effect to serve farmers everywhere, and we believe deeply in what the farmer watershed groups have proposed. And this piloting a deep soil future for Vermont, for us, is a farmer-led discovery framework for achieving security and new wealth for Vermont. It's measurement infrastructure to manage our civilization. It's using the satellite measured energy, water, and biomass, a handful of ground instrumented and soil mapped anchor farms, every willing farmer becoming a key data contributor and a researcher in a statewide learning system, measured production of natural capital and ecosystem services, and collaboration between agencies, researchers, farmers, municipal managers, state governments, everybody, to get to price discovery. What is the value of the natural capital and the ecosystem services that farmers can produce when we increase infiltration, water holding capacity, soil, organic matter, soil depth, and all these things? And working to, in effect, do ecological economic development. So it's our contention that it's time to hire Vermont farmers to grow the measured natural capital infrastructure and ecosystem services we all need. And we're going to do everything in our power to support the farmers as they lead us forward. And our closing question is, how can this working group support the Vermont watershed farmers and all of their partners as they work to pilot this new approach? I had to skip over about 50% of the presentation, but I appreciate the time, and I'll definitely answer any questions that come up.
So, Abe, this is a question that just in terms of ratio, when you think about, imagine there was and you can change the assumptions here. Imagine there's a pilot project of 15 farms of the appropriate size in Vermont, and you're going to invest in, you're going to give them the monitoring tools, all the kind of apps and things that you talked about, and then, you know, you're going to give them a period of time to make improvements. You're going to pay them something for whatever improvements they make. I'm just curious about, like, what's the ratio of cost in this pilot between kind of the evaluation, the data gathering, the instrumentation, you know, vis-a-vis the kind of dollars we could actually give to the farmer, assuming that they improved X, Y, or Z? Is this like to scale it up, starting a like 80% investment in the technology and 20% investment in the payments, and then over time that will switch? How would this work?
It's a good question. And in effect, all I can, there are a lot of ways to slice that. Numerous payment for ecosystem services valuation studies. It's not uncommon to find that a dollar invested in landscape health and watershed function provides a return of 10. That's 1 to 10. Now, we are a hopeful contractor to the farmer watershed group's proposal for this pilot project, and how they structure that pilot determines so much. And so really, I think that the farmer watershed groups and their scientific partners making their case and developing their plan is really the best single answer to your question. I do know that as in any scientific endeavor, your upfront costs are high and rapidly decrease. And in fact, environmental biophysics are this secret weapon we have for making the fewest possible ground measurements possible, combining that with the remote sensing and all of the measurement synthesis modeling to be able to have very high return for any single measurement. Because you make a measurement, it plugs into the system, and it's always operating relative to what we're getting about energy, water, and plant growth from the satellite measurement component. So I don't know the answer to your question, but the other piece of all this, of course, is the nature of ecological economics. And at this point, we're living in a natural capital constrained world where standard economic theory would have you invest in your scarcest form of capital to keep the whole endeavor moving forward. And when we look at ecological economic development, investing in topsoil and watershed function is actually probably going to be our highest return. How we discover those prices, the prices that are going to make sense, are going to come from reality-based pilot projects, as opposed to trying to make this up in our heads. But the prices, there's nothing cheap about any of this, and our proposals to the Farmer Watershed Group were certainly on a multi-million-dollar per year basis. But it all depends on how they choose to structure it and roll it out and so forth. We have not yet, I have never heard a number as high as 15 fully instrumented farms. But one of the benefits is every single farmer who wants to participate having software in their hands where they're recording their management actions and being able to compare that to the remotely sensed plant growth, energy, and water.
Thanks so much, Abe. Folks, I'm going to allow the participants to talk, and you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question at this point. It won't turn on your video, but it'll allow you to speak, or you can feel free to type one in if you prefer.
So Abe, Neil here, really interesting, and I would like to maybe get the opportunity to see the back end of your presentation in some detail, and maybe with a couple of my colleagues here at DEC, certainly Marley, maybe Ethan Swift and some others. I'm sort of curious if you've contemplated trying to knit together a package of farmers in a particular watershed so that not only could you be monitoring the value of all the practice going in on the farms, but we could actually monitor what's going on in the surface waters as well.
It's an absolute possibility. I mean, pick a watershed that's struggling. I mean, we all can name a few, and one or two jump to mind, and that would absolutely be an opportunity, because really this is an MRI for land. And choose a watershed, choose a catchment, choose a basin, a small lake, for example, and put all these pieces together, and we're going to be able to put together the puzzle pieces to really see where are the highest returns and the biggest progress coming from. But it really to me, it's important to go beyond practices, because I've known, for those of us as farmers on the ground, that the 2-page fact sheet on the practice doesn't guarantee the outcome that we're after. It's the whole system management. And in a lot of ways, of course, the subsidized best management practices are a big opportunity and pretty necessary for us to be able to access the capital to make the next strategic investment in managing soil formation.
So I do get that, and if I use the term practice, it's sort of practice, you know what I mean? It's kind of what I typically do, but I'd love to know who else is on the phone. I haven't been able to find the sort of participants panel, but who are on the line here likely are aware that NRCS is supporting a 5-year new paired watershed study under their comprehensive environmental assessment program or effects assessment program, something like that, SEEP. And there's going to be one control watershed that is instrumented, gauged, new gauges are in place now, and one intervention watershed. I believe that one is North Fork of the Dead Creek. And so that, I would think, presents a very interesting opportunity to do what you're talking about here, and maybe focus some of this together with some of the other stacks of practices that NRCS is contemplating.
I agree, and our approaches are very different than the edge of field instrumentation engaging, but it's always been our hope that the environmental biophysics, both the instrumentation and the modeling, are applied in parallel with existing measurement practices and develop in parallel. Because I don't think there's there's no way to win with either or stuff. It's the synthesis that's going to emerge inevitably. And of course, we're pretty deeply focused on measurement. And we all know that models are only as good as the measurements that go into them. And with more measurement, we're all going to benefit. So that's a welcome opportunity.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. And just in case, I don't know if participants can see who is on, we have Neil, Dan Lerner, Judson Peck, Ryan, somebody from VACD. Can't actually tell who it is. Is that Nancy or some other? So any other questions from folks? Feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to speak.
Easy crowd.
I hear that it's Jess Buckley from VACD, and she says hi and thanks, Abe.
Welcome. Thanks in return. Overall, I guess one thing that I would say is, and I definitely put myself in a mousetrap, there's just a lot of complexity in all this. And I had a very good day recently doing field measurements with Judson, and we were only making a few of the critical measurements. But we had 5 or 6 hours to talk, and we started getting into some of the depth required to understand all the environmental biophysics and the measurement instruments. But it was a great help to have Judson out with us. And this fall, all fall long, we were doing these field days where we were measuring with people in the field so they could see these are working instruments and we can make these select measurements and then begin synthesizing the data. It's just one of these things that really is best understood, and to make the value clear, we do it by doing it rather than talking about it. So that's why I'm so appreciative of the Vermont Farmer Watershed Groups proposing, let's put this together and do it on the ground, as opposed to just trying to understand it conceptually.
Thanks. Okay, folks, any other questions? I think, this won't be our only opportunity to chat with Abe, and Abe's been following along with the working group meetings as well, so we can continue the conversation. But any other questions in this forum? Okay. Well, Abe, really appreciate your taking the time to give us this presentation and to share some of your thoughts, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining. This has been recorded, so we'll make it available on the website for those who weren't able to attend in person. Really appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good day, folks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Abe. Oh, Neil, did you want to chime in, or are you just saying goodbye?
Thank you. I'll send you an email, Abe.
Thank you, Neil. Take care, everybody. Thanks for all your work. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.